So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to be in this amazing location and for moderating this discussion with Jean-Philippe. So I'm going to start presenting ecological models, so in high-dimensional theoretical ecology, and then also opening new direction in theoretical ecology. And then in the second part of the session, Jean-Philippe will present a model of interest in economics. And we will try to gather a common question between ecology and economics, so we will try to make this discussion as interactive as possible. So, you know, the field of theoretical ecology is gathering momentum in recent years, reached by an explosion of experimental results and increasingly sophisticated techniques, but is also motivated by crucial questions that have been partially answered or still need an answer. And so, for instance, we can start with this set of questions. So, what is diversity? So, there exist different metrics for accounting for diversity, so the number of different types of different species in a community. And depending on the metrics, you can, for instance, use the exponential of a Shannon entropy or other kind of metrics that allow you to define the diversity and to take also phylogenetic relationship between different types into account. And also you can wonder, okay, what is stability? Is the capacity to recover from external disturbances, is the ability to buffer invasion. Well, this positive or negative relationship between diversity and stability originated with this famous Nature at the beginning of 2000, but is still an open question. And so is somehow framed as diversity-stability debate. So I will come back to this question at the end of my talk. Then you can wonder, how does an ecosystem respond to an external perturbation? So is it possible to quantify response functions in a similar way as we do for physical system? And also, is the same ecosystem more likely to relax to a single fixed point regime or to multiple fixed points? And what are their typical features? Are they stable, unstable, marginally stable? And also, is it possible to detect in a real ecosystem chaotic dynamics, and how to quantify these chaotic dynamics through the Lyapunov exponents and so on. So over the years, we have been working different techniques. We have been using cavity method that you have learned about today and last week, replica method that was not explained so far, but I promise I won't enter into the details today. Katz-Rice computation that was presented by Valentina, dynamical mean field theory, and also random matrix theory, because actually you can have access to the properties of eigenvalues and eigenvectors to try to figure out what happens in terms of localization and delocalization transition. So let's say that this first question had been somehow addressed, but there is still much to be done in theoretical ecology and also in economics. For instance, measuring in vivo interaction is very hard, is very challenging. And so synthetic communities, artificial community in vitro, come into play, allowing us to have a validation of general principle and the emergence of generic patterns. And also you can wonder, okay, what happens in terms of interaction? So Guy today explained different models, for instance, generalized Locke-Volterra model. But the problem of this model is that the interactions are drawn from a given distribution which is fixed, is a Gaussian distribution or another distribution without long tails. And so what we know from ecology is that evolution and ecology are actually entangled. And so what you should take into account is the presence of temporal fluctuation in species interaction that basically evolve, so that basically are related to timescales, to phenomena that occur on timescale that are comparable with population dynamics. And another problem of theoretical ecology is that statistical models, so statistical continuous distribution like gamma distribution, Gaussian distribution, exponential distribution, are characterized by light tails, which is not what we observe in real ecosystem, in nature. If you think of ecological collapses or disturbances like the distribution of fires in a limited region or the population spread in the rate of population spread, you know that the typical kind of distribution is a power law or an EV-tail. And so you can wonder how to properly capture these EV-tail distribution that are of interest in ecology, but also in economics. And so this is the reason why I pointed out here black swan fluctuation, and I think Jean-Philippe will talk more about that later. And then, concerning, again, empirical observation, you can wonder whether the logistic growth behavior for describing self-regulation term is the proper way, is the good choice. And then at the end of my talk, I will discuss how different growth scaling can come into play. And in particular, I will present a model of sublinear growth, because depending on whether you are considering surface effect or not, you can be prone, it can be more appropriate to use other kind of behavior. And I will conclude with some perspective about spatial ecology and the violation of CEP, so competitive exclusion principle, when also spatial effect play a role. So over the years, theoretical physicists, mathematicians have attempted to make sense to these ballooning variables by using different techniques, linear stability analysis, theory of dynamical systems. But the true novelty now is that there is a growing focus on systems composed by an enormous number of variables, an enormous number of components. And so in this limit, in this regime, we can take advantage of statistical mechanics tools and statistical mechanics of disordered system, as you have learned during these 10 days. And so we can try to figure out and to characterize emergent mechanisms and collective behaviors in terms of phase transition. So here I'm listing a few papers that open the route to this new approach. And today I'm going to focus on these two benchmarks in theoretical ecology. So on one hand, the MacArthur model, which is also known as resource competition model, and on the other hand, the generalized lockable terra model. So the MacArthur model is a purely competitive model. So it lends itself just to describe competitive interaction. Then to go further and to model competitive or cooperative interaction, you can resort to this generalized lockable terra model. So let's get started with the resource competition model or MacArthur model. So it's described by a set of couple equations, one for the concentration for the species abundances, Ni, where I is an index that runs from 1 to S, and another one for the dynamics of the resources, the concentration of the resources, where the index L runs from 1 to M. And M is the total number of resources in the pool. So the first equation is described by this term here. So you have Ni times a growth function. And what is in the parentheses? Well, you have sigma IL, which is a metabolic strategy matrix or consumer preference matrix. And R of CL is a growth rate that can be taken as a linear function or a monode function. So defined by, so you can have something like that, which is called a mono function. So you have CL plus KL, where KL is resource-dependent parameter. And then you have MI, which is the minimum requirement of the species. But this dynamical equation is coupled to the dynamics of the resources. And so the evolution of the concentration of the resources encodes this term that accounts for abiotic factors like temperature or pH variation, and CL, which is biotic resources. And then you have this other term that has an opposite sign with respect to the first equation. So starting with this model, this coupled dynamics between species and resources, you can get some information. First of all, by imposing that the first equation is equal to 0, you can get information, insight into the steady state population. Then by requiring that this growth function here in parentheses greater or smaller than 0, you can get a criterion for invasibility or non-invasibility. And then requiring that Ni is greater or equal than 0, you will get feasible equilibria. And Jean-Philippe will talk more about that in economics. And so this model was originally studied by MacArthur and Levins at the end of the 60s. And the only problem is that if you look at the landscape of configuration, it's just described by a convex landscape. So it's just defined by a unique fixed point, a unique minimum. So we will see later how we can generalize this model, and in particular to try to figure out if the landscape of configuration can develop a ruggedness, a rough structure. But what I would like to present now is a generalization of this model in the presence of space. Why? Because according to niche theory, we know, and it was presented by Guy last week, so we know that at most n consumer species can safely coexist in the presence of m resources. However, when you take also spatial effect into account, the situation can be dramatically different. And so in this recent paper, so the group of Maritain and co-workers have considered this generalized MacArthur model in the presence of space. So they had a space dependence here on the two equations, and in particular this term, which is written as a gradient of a flux, J, that explicitly depends on the position x and the time t. And so you can think of this term as originated from foraging, chemotaxis, or crowding effect due to the concentration of resources, so to the limited number of resources. And then by performing a spatial coarse-graining, so by rewriting this flux in a proper way, so they end up with an effective coarse-grained description of this MacArthur model. And the basic idea, so the underlying mechanism, is that this term provides a stabilizing mechanism. And in particular, they could observe an additional phase on top of the CPE, so the phase which is in agreement with competitive exclusion principle. So they basically found out two different phases, one which is in agreement with competitive exclusion principle, and another one that violate this competitive exclusion principle that is actually related to this spatial effect. So this is a generalization of this model that is currently in an ongoing project of the group. But then another nice generalization, as I anticipated before, is what happens to this model when you change this matrix of the interaction. So the peculiarity of the MacArthur model is that there is no direct species-species interaction. So the interaction are mediated by the indirect consumption of resources. However, when you change the structure of these two equations, and in particular you assume a different distribution of coefficient between growth function and depletion of resources, you can find something really interesting. So as I said, so this model with the same coefficient, so with the same sigma matrix, is just described by a single fixed point. So the landscape of configuration is purely convex, and so irrespective of the initial condition you start from, you will end up on the same ending, on the same stationary states. However, if you change the distribution between growth function and depletion rate, you can find different conditions, and in particular, depending on the different initial condition, you can also observe a richer dynamics, which is characterized by limiting cycles and chaotic behavior. So then, as a next question, you can wonder, okay, so at this level, we have the abundances of resources and the abundances of the species that fluctuate on the same footing. But what happens if the dynamics of one of the two equations is much faster than the other? So suppose for a while that the dynamics of the resources is much faster than the dynamics of the species. Well, you can write this equation, you can impose this equation just equal to 0. You can solve this equation, you get a function of r as a function of n, you plug into the first equation, and so in this way you will recover the generalized lockable terra model. So you have just the dynamics for the species abundances. And so in the next part, I'm going to describe the generalized lockable terra model. So it was introduced already by Guy this morning without demographic noise. And I want to be as general as possible, so I will consider the dynamical equation, so the Langevin equation for the generalized lockable terra model, in the presence of demographic noise and in the presence of migration. So we have this equation for the relative species abundances, Ni, in the sense that Ni has been normalized by the total number of individuals in the pool, and I is an index that runs from 1 to s, where s is the total number of species. And so this Langevin equation is described by a first self-regulation term that is, in this simplified scenario, is just defined by a quadratic potential. And so you see that this potential admits two fixed points. One in an I equal to 0, that corresponds to the extinction and is an unstable fixed point. And another one in an I equal to Ki, which is the carrying capacity, that corresponds to a stable fixed point. So this means that if one species I experiences overcrowding, its immediate environment, it will be pushed back to its own value of the carrying capacity Ki. Then, okay, so this one, as I said, is the simplest possible scenario. You can also consider of modifying this potential, and you can also take high-order interaction potential. For instance, with Giulio, we consider a cubic interaction potential that has 3 fixed points and allow for the modelization of the so-called Ali effect, so for cooperative behavior in ecosystem. But for the moment, I would like to stick to this model. And then you have this other term that I'm gonna detail in a while that basically describe interspecific effect. And then, as I said, so I want to be as general as possible, so I will introduce a demographic noise that scale at square root of ni, as you have learned also during Eric lectures, and an immigration parameter. Why the immigration is so relevant? Well, if you don't put the immigration here, the problem is that at finite time, all species will get extinct because of this demographic fluctuation. So you need to introduce this immigration term that prevent an absorbing boundary in an I equal to 0. And so the main assumption to get an exactly solvable model is to start from a well-mixed community. So as you can see, there is no space dependence. Model this demographic fluctuation in terms of a wide Gaussian noise with 0 mean and variance given by this expression, where T is the amplitude of the demographic noise. And then, as I said, the next step is how to model this alpha j. So inferring the interaction in a diverse rich ecosystem is an open inference problem, and I'm going to enter into the details in a while. But at the first level analysis, we can just assume that these alpha are drawn from a given distribution, so a Gaussian distribution or any other distribution without long tails, which is parameterized by the first 2 moments. So as Guy taught this morning, so this alpha j have the mean mu over s and the variance sigma squared over s, where descaling 1 over s is crucial in such a way to recover a well-behaved thermodynamic limit. And then you have this other parameter gamma that account for the degree of symmetry or asymmetry between these coefficients. So if you start with gamma equal to 1, so symmetric interaction, you can have a Lyapunov function, an Hamiltonian operator, and so you can basically study the phase diagram by using replica method and so on. And so here I'm going to show you the phase diagram that has been obtained for this generalized Lotka-Volterra model in infinite dimensions, so when the number of species is sent to infinity. For T, where T is the amplitude of demographic noise as a function of sigma, so the standard deviation of this random matrix. And so you see, when demographic noise is sufficiently high, the system is in a single equilibrium phase, meaning that the landscape of configuration is purely convex. Then you can pretend to decrease T, the amplitude of demographic noise, and to increase sigma. And at a certain point, the system will cross this blue line, which is an instability line of the single equilibrium phase. Or for people who are familiar with disordered system, is the stability line of the replica symmetric ansatz. And so you will enter this multiply equilibria phase, which is characterized by this apparent two-level structure. So we also gave a characterization in terms of the complexity or configurational entropy that accounts for the log of the number of equilibria at the given free energy density, average over the disorder, and evaluated in the thermodynamic limit. And we end up between the blue and the orange curve with a complexity which is strictly positive. And so this means that the number of equilibria in this phase is exponential into the system size, which is particularly timely if you think of stability landscape and ecological resilience concept that have been proposed over the years to explain this apparent emergence of alternative stable states in real communities. And I would like also to stress this recent experiment by Jeff Gore group that have been presented by Guy this morning, where you can basically change the amount of nutrients and you can actually observe different phases, so stable coexistence, partial coexistence, or a phase of persistent fluctuation in real ecosystem. But from a theoretical point of view, the most interesting part is that if you go deeper and deeper in T, or you keep increasing sigma, at a certain point you will cross this orange line, which is an instability line of the multiply equilibria phase, and you will enter this Garner phase, which is characterized by a structure of meta-basin, so a hierarchical and fractal structure of this basin of attraction. And so at this level, you can wonder what happens if I switch a small degree of asymmetry. So this phase diagram has been obtained for symmetric interaction. What happens if I switch a small degree of asymmetry? And so the first two phases are expected to remain there, in particular the single equilibrium phase and the multipla equilibria phase, because actually here the equilibria are globally stable and locally stable, but this phase will be replaced by an exponential number of chaotic attractors. And so Valentina and co-workers have worked out a complexity computation a la cat's rice, and so they obtained these two different curves for the quenched and annealed complexity, and they actually confirm that the complexity here in this multiple attractor phase is strictly positive, confirming an exponential number of chaotic attractors here. However, this last phase, this Gardner phase, will be completely washed out, because the equilibria here are marginally stable. And so it's sufficiently to switch a small degree of asymmetry, so to add a non-conservative force in the dynamics to completely wipe it out this phase. Okay, so far so good. We have a complete picture in terms of the thermodynamics, but what can we claim in terms of the dynamics? Well, we can resort to a dynamical mean field theory approach that was presented by Guy this morning, so I won't enter into the details. And according to this dynamical mean field theory picture, we can basically study what happens in terms of correlation function. So here, in the single equilibrium phase, if you look at the dynamical correlator, so for n of t prime, you will see here, as you might expect, you will see that the dynamical correlator will converge to a stationary points, and the dashed line correspond to Q0, so the theoretical predicted value within the replica picture. And so the dynamics here is purely stationary and satisfy time translational invariant property, in the sense that the correlation function does not depend separately on two times, but just on the difference t minus t prime. However, if you look at this phase here, in the multiply equilibria phase, the dynamics is no longer stationary, but the dynamical correlators start displaying aging. So the longer you wait, the longer the system takes to decorrelate. And then you can wonder what happened again if you add a small degree of asymmetry. Well, this has been studied in this paper by Felix Seurat and co-workers. And so you can find two dramatical different situations depending on whether you are considering immigration or not. So with immigration, you will find just a stationary chaotic dynamics, and without migration, you will recover aging. Okay. So now I would like to give you some intuition and to make some connection with empirical data. And in particular, I would like to use this generalized Locke-Volterra model and the emergence of the ruggedness of the landscape in the generalized Locke-Volterra model to connect it to different physiological states in the gut. So here I'm presenting a work in collaboration with Jacopo Pasqualini, who is a joint PhD student at the University of Padua, Samir Zwai, Samos Maritan, and co-workers from the gastroenterological department in Padua. So here we are considering data that are public available from the Human Microbiome Project for healthy and unhealthy patients, where for unhealthy I mean patients that are affected by different inflammatory bowel disease, that are colitis or Crohn's disease, or other inflammatory syndromes of the gastrointestinal tract. And we are comparing the OTUs, so the order abundance, as a function of samples, where for samples I mean different individuals, different patients. So here on the right part we have healthy patients, and on the left part we have healthy patients, on the rightmost part we have unhealthy patients. And why you see just a few species? Well, because these data have been previously averaged, so there's been a taxonomic grouping plus coarse graining over species, and this is the reason why you just see the most relevant species. But as I said, so contrary to most of the studies that basically leverage long time series for individual gut microbiomes, here we're sticking to singular temporal snapshot, because we can have access to mean abundance and high order correlation between the abundances of the species. And so these parameters turn out to be particularly convenient to be compared with theoretically motivated order parameter in a disordered system approach, and in particular in a replica picture. So the next step is to figure out how this sampling protocol works, and in particular, so sticking on the single equilibrium regime of the generalized Locke-Volterra model, we compute these three quantities that are three order parameters, so QD, Q0, and H. And so as I said, we have just to figure out what is the sampling protocol. So we interpret the average over species as an ensemble average, and the average over R independent patients as a disorder average. So, yeah? Okay, so I is the index for the species, okay, and J is the patient. Okay, so here this internal average is indicated with the bracket, so it's a thermal average, and the external one is an average over different patients that are assumed to be independent, one from the other. Okay, so the strongest assumption that we are making is that we assume to be in the single equilibrium phase in such a way that we can use ergodicity. Okay, so that we can basically exchange the temporal average and the sample average, okay, the ensemble average. And so here we are computing the three parameters, so QD, which is a self-overlap, Q0, which is the interstate overlap, and H, which is a mean abundance. And we are comparing these other parameters in the different data set, for healthy in blue and for disease in red. So I don't have time to enter into the details, so if you're interested, we can discuss during the coffee break. So let's focus for the moment on just on the blue and the red points. So the gray dot have been obtained for a null model, so by just randomizing data from the two cohorts for healthy and unhealthy, just to try to figure out what is the compositional distance between the two cohorts. But so if you look at this, yes?
This is from the model, what you showed me.
No, these one are from the data. These one are from the data, so and you see also the error bar. But the important point is that we can compare these estimated order parameters from the data, so for healthy and unhealthy, with a similar expression obtained within the replica picture. So we have closed form equation for QD, Q0, and H.
So my question maybe will come later, because how do you decide? I mean, what is an healthy or
What is that?
what is healthy or unhealthy or healthy or diseased in the model? How do you distinguish the two? What are the
It will come later. Yeah. So, given this picture, the next step will require the introduction of a cost function that basically accounts, so this cost function can be, so the main purpose of this work is try to infer the interaction of the model to distinguish between healthy and unhealthy. So we define a cost function in this way. So given the information on pi, so given the information on H, the mean abundance, Q0, QD, and K, which is the current capacity, the main goal is to extract information on theta. So the vector of parameters, so the interaction matrix, the noise amplitude, and the migration. And now you can claim, okay, but we are not guaranteed that this cost function admits a unique fixed point, and you are perfectly right. And this is the reason why we define this cost function as a combination of squared relative errors of the three quantity. And we define this cost function in terms of squared relative errors, where delta H, delta QD, and delta Q0 are the differences between the estimated order parameters from the model and the one computed from data. And then we perform a greedy search algorithm. And then, by inferring this parameter, yes.
Since you have the, if I understand you, you have the information for the patient,
Mm-hmm.
the sample.
Yes.
Why don't you take a Bayesian approach? Why do you go to a moment?
Sorry?
Why don't you look at maximum likelihood to estimate the parameter sample instead of using moments?
Yes, we can also do that, yeah. Yeah, I agree. We decided to adopt this approach, but you can also do that. And you can also compute, so given this, you can also compute all the cumulants, because we have information on that, yeah. So just to recap what we did, so we start from a generalized Lotka-Volterra model, a stochastic generalized Lotka-Volterra dynamics, and provided that this dynamics relaxes to a stationary states, we can get information of x0, x1, x2, xn. So we are basically assuming to have the information on the different samples, so the different patients. Then we perform two different kind of averages over species and in longitudinal sense over different patients. And so by computing these other parameters from the data and extremizing this cost function, we can get information on these parameters. So mu, sigma, lambda, and t. So the strongest assumption that we are making is that we are in the single equilibrium regime and community that are in the same microstates share the same statistical properties. And so in this way, we can reconstruct, we can establish the phase diagram for the noise amplitude as a function of the heterogeneity parameter. And so I want to point out that these dots do not correspond to the single patients. So they are an average, okay? So they have been averaged over all species and all different individuals or different patients. But you see that they are well clusterized. So for healthy patients, we have a picture that is well captured by high demographics noise regime, whereas for unhealthy patients in red, seems that low demographics noise is the best option. And so the darker dot correspond to the lower value of the cost function, whereas hexagonal marker correspond to the lowest value ever of the cost function, once you extremize your loss function. And we have also the SAS, so the species abundancy distribution at fixed disorder. But since we have also information on the alpha of the interaction parameters, we can also reconstruct the distribution of the alpha, so the frequency as a function of the interaction. And even though they are both captured by a Gaussian distribution, you can actually see that the sigma of an LT is much smaller, in the sense that this biosis disorder in the gut tend to reduce the heterogeneity of the interactions. So this is to give you, to make a connection with empirical data. And actually, starting from that, you can also analyze the stability of the two data sets. In particular, you can compute an Hessian matrix of the free energy and the leading eigenvalue of this Hessian matrix. And you can actually show that healthy patients are characterized by a higher stability. So a replicon eigenvalue, a leading eigenvalue of the stability matrix, which is pretty close to 1, whereas unhealthy patients are characterized by a leading eigenvalue which is scattered all over the parametric plot and is getting closer and closer to the instability line. So as a signature of the fact that unhealthy seems to be well described by a multi-equilibria regime. So this is a perspective, and then now I would like to be very rapid on this part, very brief, because it's not my work, but I would like just to point it out that this generalized Locke-Volterra model has been used recently to investigate tumor growth. And so basically the way cancer population evolve and avoid selection barriers is a combination of ecoevolutionary process, has been pointed out several times today and last week. And so the idea is that in this work, Ricard Solé and co-workers have used the GLV model, so a generalized Locke-Volterra model, to analyze cancer cell propagation. But since multiple scale of complexity take part in the propagation of the tumor, you should actually resort to different levels of hierarchy and different level of complexity. So for instance, for modeling metastatic disease, you can use a meta-community models in which you have different patches with a given dispersion rate that depends on the specific patch. To model tumor interaction, you can resort to a prey-predator system, and also to make a connection with the economic model, to model phenotypic plasticity, you can resort to dynamical system or agent-based model. And so this is just an example, so I don't want to enter into the details, but it's just an example to point it out once more, that also cancer cell evolution shares a lot of properties, a lot of features with adaptive systems that are diversity, in the sense that tumor phenotypic diversity is crucial in maintaining the robustness of the tumor, non-linearity, which is responsible for bifurcation point and reach dynamics, and also self-organization, in the sense that the tumor tend to self-organize in space and time without any external control. And so here in this work, they have used a simple generalized Locke-Volterra model without any source of stochasticity, without any migration. And from the condition that DNI in the T is equal to 0, they could detect different attractor states. So what they did is they consider 50 interacting population. They apply 2 random perturbation. And so because of these 2 random perturbation that play a role of an instantaneous shock, they could figure out what happens in terms of attractor states. And so even though you apply this perturbation at random that decrease the present number of cells, so they decrease the current abundance, you will see that after this shock, you will end up in another state which is characterized by a higher abundance. And so you can go further because this dynamics has been applied to cancer cell population, but you can use this generalized lockable Terra model also for explaining phenotypic plasticity and switching rate at a finite time in a double well or four well potential. And so there are several implications at this level. What are the therapeutic development, or what are the implications for cancer cell research? What is the effect of plasticity? And another point that I want to stress is about the growth scaling. Okay, so here we have a simple scaling, so a logistic behavior for this function, so a linear behavior for Ri, which is the growth rate, Ni. And so now you can wonder, okay, is this kind of of growth behavior the right one for describing tumors? Well, it has been observed that in leukemias and lymphomas exponential growth is the one that is observed. But when you have surface effects or surface ruggedness, is no longer the appropriate way of describing growth. And in particular, you should use a sublinear model. And so to connect with another recent work in this direction, I want to analyze what happens behind the logistic case. In particular, so this work has originated, so dates back to 2015, so a bunch of researchers, so Yana Ton, who is a biology at the Max Planck Institute, Michel Leroux and co-workers, have published this paper, so prey-predator power law, biomass scaling across terrestrial and aquatic biomes, and have observed basically that prey-predator biomass, but also production of the community as a function of biomass, has a sublinear behavior, a sublinear growth. And so we try with Yana, Onofrio. Just wait a minute and I will go to the equation. So basically you have n to the k, okay, so the abundance to the k, where k is an exponent less than 1, smaller than 1. In this work, they analyze prey-predator biomass or overall production of the community as a function of biomass. The production, so the offspring as a function of biomass. Okay? So it has been observed at the community level, but also at the individual ontogenetic level. So the first work is this one, this science, dating back to 2015. And then we did an analysis in this other paper in the last 2 years, so it has been a long work. So what we did, so we wanted to analyze this model in an analytical way. So we used this data that have been collected over the years for production as a function of biomass across different community types. So in red, you have mammals, then you have in phytoplankton, in yellow, marine ecosystem, but also grassland in magenta and so on. And so here you can see the histogram of the different exponents where just one species, so just piscivorous lake fish do not fit with this exponent which is between 0 and 1. So piscivorous lake fish deserve much more investigation, but all the others fit between 0 and 1. And so why this work? Well, because ecological theory has long predicted, based on generalized lockable Terra model with logistic growth, and also Robert May's seminal work, that diversity, so diverse and more diverse ecosystems, tend to beget instability. So this was the original prediction by Robert May and by the generalized lockable Terra model with logistic growth, but it's not what you observe in nature. So it's somehow stunning, it's somehow surprising if you think of the great diversity which is observed in real ecosystem. And so what we try to do here is to have a rigorous and analytical picture for this data. And so we compare logistic growth with sublinear behavior. So here in blue you have logistic behavior where you have a in blue you have light blue you have logistic behavior where you have a linear term and the second order term for the loss. So it's called mass action law. Whereas for the sublinear behavior, you have R, so the growth rate, B, which denotes the biomass, to an exponent K, which is smaller than 1. So you have a sublinear behavior for the growth and the linear loss term. And so here we compare a logistic with sublinear. So, and even though logistic and sublinear seems to predict the same thing, so the same kind of situation at the individual level, at the population level, it's not exactly the same at the community level. So the sublinear model turned out to be much more stable upon increasing the diversity of your ecosystem. So we propose a theoretical framework to show how competitive interaction can actually collectively stabilizing with diversity. And so here I'm showing the community matrix, so the eigenvalue distribution for the logistic model compared to the sublinear model. So, and you can see here, so in the complex plane for the imaginary part as a function of the real part, that in the logistic model, the smallest eigenvalue is pushed towards 0 as a signature of instability when you increase the number of species, whereas in the sublinear model, the smallest eigenvalue is pushed away from 0. And so these two plots, so the probability of finding a stable system as a function of species diversity and the community matrix has been obtained for small sigma, but then you can also establish the phase diagram as a function of sigma and mu in the heterogeneous case, so in the disorder system case. And so here we have the phase diagram where sigma and mu has been rescaled in this way. And so you see that in the logistic case, the transition line between stable and unstable is roughly uniform, so is uniform. Whereas in the sublinear case, you have an ever increasing function. So upon increasing the diversity, the system is much more stable. So I can go into details if you want, but since I don't have time, so since I have just 15 minutes, I will go to my perspective for future research. So thus far I presented two different models, so the MacArthur model and the generalized Locke-Volterra model, and I would like to give you some open direction for future investigation. So to my mind, the first interesting question to answer is how to explore the multiple attractor phase to catch empirical species abundance distribution. So this is a work in progress with the group in Padua. Then this is also connected to advanced inference technique in the non-convex regime for detecting different disease in the gut microbiome. As I said, so we try to connect the ruggedness of the landscape of configuration to different physiological states that can emerge in the gut. And so this will be a work in progress also with nearby next year. And then another important point is this connection, this entangled dynamics between evolution and ecology. So it was pointed out several times. Okay, so at the first level analysis, we have a matrix of interaction which is fixed, so the disorder is quenched, but we know that is not the appropriate way to describe real ecosystem. So recently there has been this paper by the group again of Samir Weiss, Ferraro, Azel and co-workers, in which they modify the matrix of the interaction in this way. So basically you have the mean, which is fixed, so mu over S, plus sigma alpha ij, where the alpha ij have these covariants that explicitly depends on time. And so in particular, so here for alpha ij, alpha KL of t and t prime, they consider this kind of behavior, exponential of minus t prime divided by 2. So you have this kind of kernel, this kind of behavior that depends on the time difference t minus t prime. And so the main difference that emerged with respect to the quenched disorder case is that in the quenched disorder, if you consider negative growth rate, species with negative growth rate are pushed to the extinction at large time. Here, this is not the case. So with this annealed noise case, you will recover, you will find out recurrent quasi-cycles with alternative cycles, so alternative low period and high period abundances. And so it's interesting because it's what is typically observed also for boom and bust dynamics in planktonic communities. So I think it's a nice direction for the future, and it's also a nice direction if we manage to modify this function, because this function actually depends again just on a single time difference, t minus t prime. It would be interesting also to take into account kernel, so correlation function that separately depends on two different times. It's going to be extremely challenging, but also more interesting, I think, for from several perspectives, also for economy. And then another question related to this interaction is how to properly disentangle noise from true signal. Okay, so there is a huge literature on the subject, so cleaning large random matrices, but it will be interesting to better explore this perspective and to figure out how, so what is the part that actually comes from the true signal and what is the part that comes from environmental or demographic noise. And then, as I pointed out in my last part, so there is this huge debate, so this long-standing debate between diversity and stability, if there exists a positive or negative relationship between diversity and stability. So there have been several works for this sublinear, for trying to explain the sublinear growth that emerged from the data, but there is still much to be done. And also just last few words about spatial ecology. So all the results that I presented thus far are in the thermodynamic limits. So we found out the single equilibrium phase, multiple equilibrium regime, Gardner, and so on, in the thermodynamic limits. So by sending the number of species to infinity. But are these phases persistent? So can you recover this phase when you consider also finite size effect? And so what about the Gardner phase? What about the amorphous-like phase? Is this mean field picture robust enough? And then you can wonder, okay, what is the upper critical dimension of the model, and so on. Well, there have been different approaches. So one possibility is to include meta-communities, so to consider a network of ecological community that are coupled by passive dispersion. And so the main difference with respect to the generalized Locke-Volterra model that I presented at the beginning without any, in a well-mixed approximation, is that here the migration is not fixed as an external reservoir, is not imposed from outside, but is inherent in the dynamics. And so because of this last term here, you have an insurance, a rescuing effect. So one species can get extinct in a given community, but because of this insurance effect that depends on the dispersion rate divided by L, so the number of patches, you can repopulate that community. And so depending on whether you consider heterogeneous interaction or not, you can observe, you can detect different phase transition. So without any interaction at all, so this model displays a continuous phase transition that belongs to the same universality class as directed percolation. Then, and so the directed percolation transition depends on the interplay between demographic noise and dispersion rate. Whereas when you switch on interaction, and in particular you assume this alpha ij to be random, you can detect a discontinuous phase transition with metastability behavior and hysteresis loop and so on. And another nice direction is for the introduction of a random network structure in the generalized Locke-Volterra model. So recently, the group of Galla and also Joseph, who is no longer here, so they analyzed this generalized Locke-Volterra model where both A, so the adjacency matrix, and alpha are two random matrices. And so then you assume an arbitrary degree distribution, which is parameterized in this way. And so you can see that the picture is completely different in terms of species abundancy distribution. So for the single degree, you will recover the truncated Gaussian, so the one that was presented by Guy this morning. But if you take this random structure into account, you will find something more interesting, which has a non-analytical form but can give interesting result for the appealing result for the future, and in particular can open appealing direction in many different from many different perspectives. Yeah.
In this model, do you have some kind of a carrying capacity?
Yeah, actually here the carrying capacity is fixed to 1 because the role of the carrying capacity is just a rescaling, okay? So at variance with the growth rate, so the growth rate can actually change the picture, but the carrying capacity provides just a rescaling. And so also in the model that I presented before, so the sublinear model, if you change the carrying capacity, the change is just at the quantitative level, but not at the qualitative level. Yeah, okay. And so with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I remain 1 hour, and so...
Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me. So I tried to conform to Giulio's wish to do everything on the blackboard. So it means that I won't go into much details because 1 hour is really short. But what I want to do is to give you a few ideas of contact points between ecology and economics. And so this is very much in infancy. There's a lot to do. You'll see why. So I'm going to speak first about the motivation, excess fluctuations in economical systems. Then I'll tell you about how economists think about this problem and how they define equilibrium. Then within this framework, this classical framework, I'll show you that there's immediately this question of feasible equilibria that will arise, interestingly, with strong connections with GLV. Um, then I'll argue that maybe this is a scenario for criticality of these systems, still within equilibrium, and why there should be excess fluctuations. But then I'll destroy everything and say, well, maybe this whole approach is completely crazy and we need to do something completely different. And that will be the dynamics part. Okay, so excess fluctuations in economical systems, if you look at most data, whether it's from macroeconomic data, the GDP of large countries, or financial data, stock market fluctuations, everything fluctuates all the time and far too much. I mean, economists are at a loss understanding why things fluctuate so much. So, for example, the argument is large economies should kind of average out idiosyncratic noise. That is, some companies do good, other companies do bad on a given year, but everything should average out. At the GDP level, nothing much should happen. So, of course, I mean, there are shocks. There are exogenous shocks, like COVID or Ukraine war or oil shock in the 70s. This is clear. When this happens, a lot of fluctuations ensue. But the problem is that in many years, there's nothing happening. And still, the GDP growth fluctuates by a few percent. So it goes up on average, like 3% a year over 50 years in the US economy. But there's a lot of fluctuations of the order of the GDP average growth itself. So where do these fluctuations come from? And economists, they say, we've worked on that problem for 200 years and we're still not sure, which is a little frightening, by the way. Anyway, so the stories are, you can read several stories. One is that there's a kind of invisible shock that I love. So, the economist doesn't know what the shock is, he's unable to observe it, but somehow the invisible hand, the smart market participants, the smart agents like you and me, we're able to work out that something is going wrong and it makes the economy fluctuate or the market fluctuate. This, I find it very non-scientific as a statement, but anyway. Other approaches, so there's the now well-known Gabex granularity hypothesis. So Xavier Gabex is a French economist who's very much physics compatible, I would say. And his idea is that there are large fluctuations in the size of entities. So, in my argument that in a big economy things should average out, is assuming that all the firms have roughly the same size. But if firm sizes is parallel distributed, which actually it is, then maybe we can't do the central limit theorem, and maybe the whole economy fluctuate because the largest components of this economy, the large firms like Walmart, they have problems and they contribute to the fluctuations. So it's an idea that makes sense, but if you really go into details, it doesn't really work. First of all, because it doesn't match the numbers, and also because there's something missing, which is collective effects. I mean, when things go bad or go well, all components of the economy seem to go more or less in sync. I mean, there are correlations between every firm. So this is lost in the idea that there's independent big objects that can fluctuate. So this has led to another type of approach, which I'm going to speak in the next few minutes, which is introducing network effects, interaction effects between firms. And this, intuitively should lead to correlations and maybe enhance fluctuations. And then there's an old idea, which is self-organized criticality, which was actually proposed in 1993 by Perback and economists in a paper that is well known but not that well known. And I think it's maybe time to revisit these ideas. So I actually have written a review paper that just came out in the archive about this self-organized criticality paradigm in economics and finance. So it was out on Tuesday. Okay, so that's the motivation. Where do these last shocks come from? So economist equilibrium. So what do economists think when they think about the system? Well, they think of the economy composed of firms. So there's a network of firms, and there are households who consume the goods that firms produce. And so we should, specify what these people do. So firms, what do they try to do? And I'm going to then explain in more details what it means mathematically. Well, they optimize profit. Okay, it's well known. Firms are supposed to maximize their profits. Maybe they should do something else sometimes, but anyway. There's a debate about this, actually. What is the responsibility of firms? Maybe it's not only to maximize profits. 2, households. So households, they work, they produce workforce, but they also consume, and they're supposed to maximize their utility, their happiness, if you want. And 3, markets, which are markets between households and firms, but also between firms themselves, because firms, in order to produce some final good, they need input goods. So they buy from one another. And so there are markets for goods, and these markets are supposed to clear. What does it mean? It means that everything that's produced gets consumed, either by firms or by households. So market clearing. Okay, so these are the 3 rules, if you want, that allows one to get enough equations. Once I'm going to specify the rules of the game, to get a full specification of equilibrium. That is, what is the production of firm I, what is the price of good I, and so on. Okay? Okay, so the first thing we will need is a so-called production function. So actually it's very close to the growth function that Ada has just talked about. So you need a kind of rule to relate the amount of goods that company I buys to the amount of goods it's able to produce, okay? So I'm going to throw at you a function which is called a CES, constant elasticity of substitution production function. It's a family of production function that is not very well justified empirically, but it gives you a kind of broad range of possibilities within which you can choose, and some of them make a lot of sense. So let me write it down. So pi I, this is production of firm I. This is given by what's called the productivity factor, Zi of t. This can fluctuate. And actually, within the context of these equilibrium model, the fluctuations of Zi of t are supposed to be the main drivers of the fluctuations of the GDP. So this is supposed to change because of technology shocks. That's what you would find in the literature. There are technology shocks which allow firms to produce more or less with a given set of goods. Okay, and then, so let me write down the full thing. Sum from j equals 0 to number of firms n, and j different from I, so we'll suppose that the firm I doesn't need its own good to produce, but I mean, it's not a big assumption. And then I'll introduce 2 matrices, so to say, and there's ambiguity in the way I'm going to write the equation because there's a kind of over-parameterization, but I'm doing it just to have some limits apparent. So Aij, Qij divided by Jij to the power -1 over Q. and the whole thing to the power q. So Jij, Aij's are coefficients, and Qij is the amount of good that firm I buys from firm J. And then there's a special index, which is J equals 0, which is labor. Okay? So, okay. So there's an extra, I mean, as I said, of course you can reabsorb Aij into Jij's, but written like that, it's also useful to normalize the Aij's like this, okay? So this is productivity, as I said. These coefficients are called the technology. How much good J do you need to build what you need, and so on. Okay, so this encodes the kind of efficiency of the production and the goods you need. So, for example, some Aij's might be 0. Firm I might not need any good from J, and so on. And something else that you should notice at this stage is this is scale invariant. That is, if I multiply all the Q's by some lambda, I multiply the productions by lambda. You can break this rule as well and have diminishing return to scale is called. That is, as you grow, you produce less I mean, you don't produce 10 times more with 10 times more inputs. But I'll stick to that for the moment. Okay. By the way, this doesn't include what people call capital. Capital is also important because it allows people to invest in machines and so on. And this is kind of hidden in the ZIFT. So there are very many limitations to this production function, but let me give you two special cases which people look regularly at. So one is when Q goes to 0 plus, and this is the Leontief production function. And that one, at least I can understand what it means. It means that pi I is equal to Zi times the minimum over J of Qij divided by Jij. So, you know, it means that every good is important for you to produce your good. So if you want to produce a car, you need tires, you need the windscreen, and if one thing is missing, you can't produce a car. Okay. Then the work horse of theoretical economics is when Q goes to infinity, to plus infinity, and this is called Cobb-Douglas. And it's pi I equals Zi. So of course you have to do a kind of replica thing when these numbers go to 0 or infinity. And in this case, pi I is a slightly modified Zi times the product over J of Qij to the power Aij. And so in this case, as in Leontief, if one Qij is 0 and the corresponding Aij is non-zero, then production stops. But it's a minor form of non-substitutability because you can, if one of the Q's go down by a factor 2, you can always find other goods to replace what you need to keep the production the same. Whereas in this case, it's not possible. So Leontief is non-substitutable. Here, Cobb-Douglas is at the limit of substitutability in the sense that it still goes to 0 when Qij goes to 0. But if Q, infinity, the next thing to plus infinity is minus infinity. And when you go to the other side of the real axis, then it doesn't matter if when Qij is 0, the production still continues. So in a sense, the Cobb-Douglas is marginal between non-substitutability and complete substitutability. Okay, so this is the rule for production. Then I said firms want to maximize profit. What is the profit of firm I? Well, the profit of firm I is its production times the price it's able to sell its goods, minus sum over J equal 1 to n of Qij Pj, minus Qi0, which is the amount of labor it needs, time W, and W I can always set W is the wage, sorry, is the price of work, and I can always set it to 1 because obviously everything is invariant when you change all prices and wages by some factor, okay? So what does it mean here? It means that you've already assumed writing this that markets will clear, because what you assume is that everything you produce is going to get bought by someone, and it's going to get bought at price PI. So at the outset, as we write the profit like this, we don't consider the fact that you might have, excess production, or that, and so on. Okay, and then we need to describe households. They are not very important in this game, but let me give you the usual description of households, HH. So households are not distinguished, so they all are the same object, if you want. They are not decomposed into households of different wealth, for example. So there's no wealth inequality, no heterogeneity here, which might be another problem, but it's not my point. So sum from I equal 1 to n of theta I log of Ci, where Ci is the consumption of good I, and theta I is the preference for good I. So this is the kind of standard choice for the utility of households. And households, they must maximize this object with a budget constraint, and their budget is clearly going to be given by the sum over I of Qi0 star times W. So this is the total amount of wages that go into the household sector. And then market clearing is that the production pi I has to be consumed either by households, so this is Ci, or by other firms, and by other firms this is the sum over J of Qji. Okay. So these are the equations that you need. You maximize Pi with respect to the Qij, you maximize U with respect to the Ci's, you do everything, and then you can count the number of equations, and you have enough equations to solve for everything, so you solve for productions and prices, okay? And in principle, this determines the equilibrium of this economy, and of course it depends on these Zi of t, which might change from one month to the next, and as I said, this is the main source of shocks in this economy. Yes? C is a consumption of the household for good I. So that's why it appears here, because the total consumption is Ci from households and Qji from other firms. Okay? Okay. Yes? Zi is, as I said, a kind of, as people say, this is hit by productivity shocks or capital shocks, or, I mean, in this field, the point is that people think in terms of exogenous shocks. So there's an exogenous source of shock, and this is supposed to be the driver. Yes, there's no idea that possibly, and I'll go back to that, the fluctuations are purely endogenous. So this is a kind of easy way to introduce fluctuations in the system. By the way, what I'm telling you here is pretty recent. It's a paper from 2012 by a pretty famous economist, in particular someone called Daron Acemoglu, and he's supposed to get the Nobel Prize in a few years. So anyway, so let's go to the third chapter here, feasible equilibria. This is from a work that we've done with José Moran during his PhD. So we just actually looked at these equations, but not in the case that was considered in the literature, the Cobb-Douglas case, in this Acemoglu paper, for example, 2012, but in other cases. And let me explain why this is going to be super important. Because it turns out that Q equal infinity is a very special limit. So, as I said, as you do what you need to do, optimization and so on, you get equations for prices in production. And for example, for prices and a similar equation for production, you get an equation like this: sum over j of some matrix mij applied to a vector of price, which is pj to the zeta, with zeta is a shorthand for 1 over 1 plus q, q being this parameter of the production function, equals some positive vector vi, which comes from essentially the consumption of households. Anyway, it would come from these guys, but I don't need to enter into the details. Okay, so that's the equation you get. So from J1 to n here. I don't have the labor in there. With a matrix Mij, which is given by Zi to the zeta delta ij minus aij to the q zeta jij to the zeta. So this form of matrices are called M matrices. That's why I call them M. And M matrices are matrices that have positive diagonals and negative off diagonals. Okay, and they have special properties, as I'm going to say. But when you look at these equations here, they look very much like the Lotka-Volterra type of equilibrium equations. And of course, it wouldn't make sense to find pi to the zeta negative, right? Because you don't know what to do with that. So you see, for example, in the Leontief case, q equals 0, and it's just linear in pi's. And so if you find negative pi's or negative productions, then clearly you have a problem. You can't interpret this as a viable equilibrium. So it means that there's a constraint on the matrix Mij in order to find that all the prices and productions are positive. Otherwise, some firms have to disappear for the economy to be viable. Like in ecology, some species have to vanish in order for others to survive. Okay, so that's already quite interesting, I think, as an analogy. By the way, there's another type of problem that we consider with Jérôme, and he can tell you about this if you're interested. The same kind of equation appears in portfolio optimization, and sometimes you have a constraint that you can only buy stocks and not have short positions, and this has the same kind of flavor. Anyway. Okay, so in general, there's potentially a problem with these equations. By the way, strangely enough, economists are happy to say, well, some firms have pi equals 0 and pi equals 0, and it's in equilibrium. I find it really bizarre. A firm that doesn't produce anything, what does it mean? But so I prefer thinking of that as bankruptcy. Anyway, let me explain to you in a second why Cobb-Douglas is special. Well, if you look at this equation for Cobb-Douglas, Q goes to infinity. There's a little bit of handling to be, it should be given a little more thought. But essentially what you find is that in that limit, I won't explain why, but because the sum of the Aij is equal to 1, and there's a Perron-Frobenius theorem and so on, I skip all the details, and you find that in this case, there's always an equilibrium. There's no constraint on productivities, on the shape of the network. There's always a well-defined equilibrium. And that's obviously why economists like this limit, because there's no problem in actually discussing this problem of bankruptcy. Okay, so in the Acemoglu paper that I told you about, from the equilibrium that, as I said, always exists as a function of the ZIT, you can compute the fluctuations of the GDP, for example, the total production, as ZIT evolves in time, assuming that at each time step you've reached equilibrium. Okay, so the idea of economists to describe fluctuations in this model is to say Zi of t is equal to something at time t. Equilibrium is immediately obtained. I can compute the production and the prices. Then t plus 1 appears. I have a new zi of t plus 1. Equilibrium immediately appears. I compute the new productions and the new prices. And from there, I compute the fluctuations of production, of total production, of GDP, if you want. And if you do that, you find that the variance of the GDP is equal to, well, the variance of the shocks of z of t, the exogenous shocks of the productivity, times a very interesting object, which is the sum over I of Si squared divided by the sum over I of Si squared, where Si is production times price. It's called the sales of the company. And what is this? This is the inverse participation ratio in physics. This is the Huffindel index in economics. It tells you how diversified is the economy. It's a measure of diversity. And so if the SIs are, kind of thin-tailed, then this is of order 1 over n, where n is the number of firms. And what you find is the variance of GDP is 1 over n. This is the central limit theorem argument that I gave you previously. And if SI are not thinly distributed, they have parallel tails, then you get the granularity argument of Gabex. So in a sense, this is a way to make the size distribution of firms come from the network effects. And in order to have an endogenous, an emergent distribution of firm size that is parallel, you need very, very special types of networks with hubs and parallel networks. So in a sense, you're pushing the problem of firm distribution into the structure of the network. But still, this is interesting, and this, as I said, made a big splash in 2012 with the Acemoglu paper. Okay, so as I said, this is a special case. Let's look at other cases. So for example, Leontiev, but any Q non-infinite would work exactly the same way. Then you have, as I said, an M matrix. Let's look at the Q equals 0 case just for simplicity, but it doesn't change much. So Mij is equal to Zi delta Ij minus Jij, okay? And so the criterion is that the inverse, so formally Pi is equal to Mij, well, M minus 1 Ij Vj summed over J. And these M matrices, they have a lot of interesting mathematical properties, which, to say the truth, I had never encountered before, so I learned about M matrices. So there's a list of properties, and you can show that there are equivalent statements, but one is that if Pi has to be positive for whatever Vj a positive vector, then the smallest eigenvalue of M should be positive. Or more precisely, because Mij could be non-symmetric, the eigenvalue with the smallest real part must be such that this real part is away from 0. It's positive, okay? So these are equivalent statements. So what we need to have a feasible equilibrium is that this matrix has only positive eigenvectors, positive eigenvalues, by which I mean, again, eigenvalues with positive real parts, okay? So let's take an example. Let's take a random regular network where each firm has C suppliers taken at random and C equal 3, and the same firm with a different color has 3 clients, just to, as an illustration. Then the spectrum of this matrix is well known if we assume that all the Jijs are equal and all the Zs are equal. In a more general case, you can define a kind of matrix ensemble, and I realized that with the work we did with Nearby, we could actually compute the spectrum of this more general beast with Zi distributed and Jij, say J libre or whatever. But in this simple case, you understand what's going on. So if we plot the eigenvalue distribution, so this is in the lambda plane, lambda being eigenvalues, then there's a circle around point Z of width J square root of C. and then there's an isolated one that is at JC away from Z. So the smallest eigenvalue lambda min is Z minus JC. And so you see clearly that in this type of economy, it can only survive as such if, well, this is in the large n limit. This is n going to infinity. If productivity is high enough, or if the number of goods you need to produce is small enough. Okay. J and C are counting the number of input goods. But as productivity is going to go down, for example, or as you need more products to construct your own good, then you see that there's a possibility that this will become unstable. This is a very simple case. You can have more complicated case where, depending on the statistics of the Z's and the statistics of the J's, there might not be an isolated eigenvalue, but it could look, I don't know, like this. And then instability will occur, not because the isolated one goes to 0, but because the edge of the bulk goes to 0. Anyway, so what you deduce from this is an interesting scenario for criticality. So that's my 4th chapter. So now if you go into the details of the calculation, and again, if you're interested, you can look at the paper that we wrote with José Moran. Then what you find is that, well, as I said, for any q not infinity, you have the same scenario, but you can study several natural evolutions of the system. So for example, you can have a network with n firms, a little bit in the spirit of May's ecology. You can have a system with n firm and add an n+1 firm. And what you can show from these equations using a kind of cavity method is that lambda min is going to go down as the system grows. You can show that, as I said, when productivity decreases, when J increases, this also leads to the smallest eigenvalue closer to 0. There's also something else, which is here we assume that profits were maximized, okay? And this leads to prices that are equilibrium prices. And if you work out what happens in this model, you find that at equilibrium, profits are exactly 0. It's the case when, as I said, there's constant return to scale, when, as I said, production function I considered is such that there's scaling invariant. If you introduce other things, it might not be the case, but you need then to say what the profit become. They're redistributed on households. It doesn't matter too much. But anyway, so if you, from the point of view of the firms, you can say, well, getting 0 profit is not really great, so I'm going to increase a little bit. This is called markup. Increase the price of my production, and instead of having PI, I'm going to make PI times some factor larger than 1. And you can show that as this factor increases, the equation become, it's exactly equivalent to decreasing Z. And so increasing markups will drive also lambda min to 0. So it means that, as the economy grows, as people are maybe not as focused on increasing productivity, because increasing productivity is costly. So, the economy grows, but people are lagging and they don't increase productivity enough for the system to be stable. Or if you think of supply chains, there's this just-in-time dogma. There's the idea that firms should have a limited number of suppliers that bring the product exactly in time, because managing a large number of suppliers is costly, is headache and so on. So you can think of having lean production chains as having a small q, and when q, this Leontief parameter, so CS parameter, gets smaller, you're also reaching faster 0. So there's a lot of vague ideas like this that remind us of self-organized criticality. That is, all these forces tend to conspire to bring the economy close to criticality. And then at this point, something must happen. And what must happen is that some firms go bankrupt, but then the whole model breaks down because you don't know what to do. Okay. And so this is nice. This is what we propose in our paper with José, that there's a kind of May instability in these economies if you accept to go beyond Cobb-Douglas. But then, as I said, does it really make sense to model the economy like this? And so I'm going to chapter 5, dynamics, and I'm going to question very much the notion of equilibrium. This looks really bizarre, right? We've just gone through a period of inflation, pretty serious period of inflation, and clearly one of the drivers of inflation is the fact that markets were not clearing. There was excess demand and not enough supply. There was a problem of supply chain gluts, and so there was excess demand, and therefore prices went up. It looks completely stupid, right? But this is impossible in that kind of model. Inflation in models used by economists is not due to supply being smaller than demand. It's really bizarre. It's strange mechanisms, but not that one. So the idea that markets clear immediately looks really strange. We know that firms have inventories. They sometimes have stockouts. This is impossible in the model. There are bankruptcies. We know this happens all the time. Bankruptcies, new firms appear. And when your supplier gets bankrupt, you need to rewire to a new supplier, maybe someone you didn't have business before, or someone new arriving in the market. So all this is not in the model. But still, when shocks appear, and in particular when large fluctuations appear, it looks really strange to assume that the economy is in a state of equilibrium at each time step. That the time needed to reach equilibrium is fast enough to be able to completely forget about transients. So we need to go beyond equilibrium. We need to introduce some dynamics. And at this point, the big problem is that whereas everything I told you before is within the realm of acceptable ideas for economists, because it's still equilibrium, it's still production function, so they argue about so one of the first arguments we got against our paper with José was, oh, this is special to Leontief, because the first thing we did was to do the calculations for Leontief. And the idea was that it was a special problem of Leontief, but not generic. But actually, it's not the case. It's the other way around. It's a problem with Cobb-Douglas to have always equilibrium. But at least, the framework is kind of classical. Now, if you want to wade into the problem of dynamics, the issue, and especially for communicating with economists, is that there's no accepted framework to describe dynamics. Because as soon as you enter these imbalances between supply and demand, then the bankruptcies, people don't really know what to do, and in the end, they don't do much within the classical framework. So what has developed is the so-called agent-based models of dynamics, where now you go back to the firm level and you don't assume that firms are optimizing and that they are able to optimize at each time step. You introduce some kind of plausible rules for firms to adapt to what they see. Okay, so you forget about this dogma that firms are infinitely rational and that they optimize to the end of time what they want to do today. You say, well, firms, when they see that what they've produced is not sold, if they have unsold goods, then they're probably going to reduce a little bit production next time step, or maybe they are going to decrease their price a little bit to get rid of their inventories and so on. So you see the idea. The idea is to introduce heuristic type of behavioral rules that I think make a lot of sense and infer the dynamics not from principles based on perfect optimization of infinitely rational agents, but based on plausible rules of the game. So we tried to do that in a paper with Théo Dessertaine and José Moran and Michael Penzaken. And we found that actually it's not that easy to implement these rules in a way that makes sense. That is, that satisfies incontrovertible rules, like you cannot consume more than what is, that what is produced and stored as inventories. You cannot consume before the thing has been produced. This is another way to say that, and so on. So you have to be pretty careful in the way you set up these dynamics not to violate things that clearly can't happen in the real world. Okay. So we came up with something like this, and as I said, in essence, we have rules when demand is not equal to supply to correct the restoring forces, if you want, behavioral restoring forces, which try to go against imbalances. Okay. And so in our dynamics, there is an equilibrium, and the equilibrium is exactly the economist equilibrium. If there are no imbalances, if supply is equal to demand and profits are maximized, then the system is in equilibrium. But now we have a set of rules that allows us to discuss whether it's plausible that the system goes into equilibrium in the first place, and if it does so, does it do so fast enough so that we can neglect transients? Okay, so it leads us to a whole interesting discussion. It's still within a context where there's no rewiring of the network, there's no bankruptcies, so there's still a lot to be done. There's no arrival of new firms. So we have another paper where we try to actually look at rewiring, because, okay, this would lead to a longer in these production functions, it's important to try to introduce the idea that firms have the choice between different suppliers, and that's not very well encoded at this point. But anyway, I won't go into that. Yes? Yes, you could have labor playing. I am going to say a little word about this, but here labor is supposed to adapt, and in some cases actually there's persistent unemployment. So, okay, so it's a proposal, and it leads to a very interesting and rich phase diagram, which again is not, I think there's a lot of things to be done still, but let me show you what type of phase diagram it leads to. So there are several parameters, but I'm going to focus on the plane of two of these parameters. One is, the x-axis is perishability. Why? Because now we have inventories, okay? So we have to say something about what happens to the goods that are not sold. Are they going to be permanent and can be reused later, or are these strawberries that are going to rot in a week? So this is no perishability at all. So it means that objects are there forever, and infinite perishability means that the next time step they're gone. Okay. And then the x-axis is what I'm going to call restoring forces. So it's essentially the coefficient by which, when firms see that supply is not equal to demand, they update prices or production. Okay. So if this parameter is large, it means that they kind of react very strongly to any imbalance. If the parameter is small, it means that they're kind of loose and they let imbalances grow before they take action. And in this phase diagram, so here I'm focusing on a case where, as I said, equilibrium exists. I'm not assuming that we're in these nasty cases where the so-called Hawkins-Simon criterion. The idea for Q equals 0, what I described, is actually has been known for quite a long time. It's called the Hawkins-Simon criterion. and it's a paper from 1949. But like in many cases, some old papers like Keynes are forgotten by the mainstream. And anyway, so we're not in a case close to criticality. So let me write it like lambda min much greater than 0. It doesn't mean anything, but you see what I mean. You're very far away from a problem of feasibility. And then what you find is that there's a whole phase here where the economy just collapses. Then there's a phase where there's what we call deflationary equilibrium. So there's a kind of persistent unemployment. So wages go down, and so all the prices go down. But if you rescale by the average price index, things are stationary. So deflationary equilibrium. And then the most interesting part is a boundary like this between economist equilibrium, which is reached by the dynamics. It is there, as I told you, it has not disappeared, it is there. And our dynamics indeed converges to this equilibrium pretty quickly, except if you're close to the boundaries, then there's a kind of critical slowdown. So you could say, well, in this case, indeed, it makes sense to follow the economists and think that the economy is close to equilibrium, at least within the framework of the model. And then there's a really interesting phase here, which is chaos or quasi-periodic, cycles. So we enter things that we've seen also for the Lotka-Volterra type of dynamics. In this case, it's really a coordination breakdown between firms' actions. So firms tend to react too strongly to the incoming signal, and this leads to a complete desynchronization of what firms should do, and it's never able to converge to anything. And what's interesting is that in this case here, in particular in the chaotic phase, but also in the periodic phase, you can have all sorts of periodic phase where firms are in sync, or each firm is periodic, but the period is shifted. But in this phase, you don't need any exogenous shocks to have fluctuations. So this is an interesting phase because here excess fluctuations are kind of infinite. They are permanent fluctuations without any shock, external shock to the system. So maybe all this, self-organized criticality, proximity of a critical point that allows one to enhance fluctuations and get something closer to what we observe. Maybe this is not the right idea. Maybe the right idea is more that we're in a kind of phase like this where firms tend to overreact, and as you see that, if things are not perishable, then it makes the problem worse because firms don't know what to do with their inventories and so on, and so they reduce production, and then this leads to unemployment, and then the whole thing kind of breaks down. Yes? Yes, so of course, I mean, at this point, there are different, depending on the scenario you prefer, there are quite different predictions about what one should measure, and this is something we need to do. But the line here is actually very special, and that's what I wanted to say. So I still have 5 minutes, yeah? Okay. Because of these because of the fact that the supply is not equal to demand, for example, the analysis of equilibrium, of perturbation away from equilibrium in these systems is immediately nonlinear, which is really interesting, and we've worked on some simple cases with Théo Dessertenne. So this is a model that we call cone-wise linear, because if demand is equal to supply, this is equilibrium, but as soon as demand is not equal to supply, for example, consumption, actual consumption, is going to be the min of demand and supply. Okay, and so depending on what side of the of equilibrium you're at, the whole set of equations will not look the same, and even at the linear level. And so what is interesting and challenging, and I think it's a beautiful kind of mathematical problem, is to analyze these cone-wise linear systems. And so, to answer your question, Giulio, here we seem to have to be kind of dominated by these cone-wise. So the system goes into one cone that looks stable, and then suddenly the vector moves in the cone and goes into the unstable region, and so there's a kind of endogenous spike of unemployment. And so this line here seems to be very strange. So this is numerical, of course. I mean, I haven't said, but this is mostly numerical. Okay, so there are many things to do. So for example, the Lotka-Volterra paradigm that we all now love, it's not been very much used in economics. There's a strand of the literature based on the two-species Lotka-Volterra, interpreted in terms of wages and employment. So there are two variables in this the kind of rabbit and fox case. But certainly the generalized multi-dimensional Lotka-Volterra to describe the joint dynamics of firms has not been explored, because it's really very remote from all this economics arguments about equilibrium and rationality and so on. But I think it's really worthwhile to see whether one can calibrate these Lotka-Volterra on actual data. And so you see, for example, you could say the size of a firm I, the SI dt, is something that depends on SI and also on the sum of J, of Aij Sj. Some firms are competing, some firms are cooperating. The existence of some firms help me growing my business. The existence of other firms are dangerous to me. So it looks very much like a Lotka-Volterra times. But for example, is it SI or SI to some power? And then something that we already know is that the noise here, it is not square root of SI. This was a surprise, empirical surprise. It's something like SI to the power 0.8. And so there are stories again to explain the SI to the power 0.8. It's a pretty nice power law over like 5 decades or something. So it looks real. But so you see clearly, even writing down a Lotka-Volterra equation that makes sense, that is inspired by data and that has to reproduce known stylized facts. For example, we know that the stationary state of such Lotka-Volterra equations must lead to a power law distribution of firms, which is close to zip, close to an exponent -2. So I haven't tried it all, but I think this is a very nice type of project. Even the eta that's here, I think that it has to have power law tails, because we know that there are big shocks, like big problems. Boeing, think of Boeing. I mean, this is a huge shock, right? And so yeah, as I said, I even didn't even try writing down the equation yet. So this is my final 2 minutes. So this is really trying to say what is completely open. So eta has to have shocks. The Aij, to some extent, in the firm network, as I said, you can choose your suppliers, and normally you don't choose your clients, but at least you can choose your suppliers. And so somehow the Aij should be dynamical, like we also discussed for Lotka-Volterra. Okay, and finally, I want to tell you just in one line about a model that we proposed very recently, again with José Moran and a group in Utrecht around Deb Panja, to try to have another view of this problem of inventories and just in time. So this is something that we call timeliness criticality, and it takes just one line to tell you the idea. So imagine that. So this is a model that comes from train schedules, and trains. If the next train has to depart at 19:02, it means that the previous train has to have arrived, means that the train driver must be there, means that the train controller must be there, and all these people, they come from different places and so on. And so clearly, if the previous train or any component needed to make the next train depart are late, the train will be late. And so you can think of that in terms of products that you need to have in your inventory to start producing. And the equation we wrote is the delay that occurs at firm I or at node I of a network at time n+1 is equal to the to the max of over all j's that belong to the neighborhood of I, so the things that need to happen before what should start at I at scheduled time starts, of tau j of n minus a time buffer, what we call the time buffer, which is this schedule lag between the arrival of the previous train and the departure of the next one, plus, which means that it's equal to tau j of n minus b if it's positive or 0 elsewhere, plus some idiosyncratic noise, epsilon I of n+1, which is a positive random variable. So you see what it means? It means that essentially it's like a kind of Leontief production function. You're limited, you're affected by the delay that's maximum, but if you introduce enough delay between the previous task and the next task, you can absorb the delay, okay? And so you can study this in mean field, for example, and you find a beautiful phase transition, which in some aspects resembles the mode coupling transition in glasses, and I don't really understand why, but it's also related to what's called bounded KPZ thing. But essentially what you find is that as a function of B, you can look at the speed of accumulated delays. That is, if you want tau I of n divided by n at large n. And what you find is that there's a critical point BC above which V is always 0, so it's kind of velocity, delay accumulations, if you want. So there's a phase where things are all right, and then as you go below BC, there are delays accumulating over the network. Yeah, this is a mean field model where, for example, each time you choose the j's at random in the network. So that's interesting because again, as I said, this is inspired by trains, and if you indeed look at trains in the Netherlands, but also in Switzerland, he has a different, Deb Panja has a lot of data on that, you see that most of the days everything runs okay, but some days a little delay in Utrecht spreads to the whole train network, and at the end of the day, everything is blocked everywhere. But nothing really happened. It's not a major disruption that happened. So this is very much similar, in spirit to these excess fluctuations in economics as well. So we like this model, and it also suggests that there's some kind of organization, natural organization of any socio-technical system around BC, because having large buffers is costly. So there's there's a trade-off which is really interesting between efficiency and resilience, because if you don't want anything to happen ever, you should have big buffers, or you should, in the language of firms, you should have large inventories. But keeping large inventories is costly, or putting large buffers in time means that less trains are going to run, or that you need more trained drivers to be there, and so on. So there's a natural tendency to optimize the system and reduce B towards where it becomes a problem. So I think this idea that in all these systems, economics, finance, socio-technical systems, there's this balance that needs to be found between efficiency and resilience is a real problem that needs to be included in the loss functions or in the thing that people want to optimize when they do policy. Thank you very much. So can you make your question a little more specific in terms of data? What do because for example, if you look at firms, the problem is that we don't really know what equilibrium is because it's not true that firms have a stable size. The size is it's a little bit like what Guy was showing earlier, right? I mean, when you look at these graphs where firms have busts and booms, and actually Ada spoke about booms and busts. So there's really a commonality of language as well in the two fields. So as I said, we haven't tried to look at this type of description or look at data very convincingly along these lines. But I think this is really interesting and it should be done. Yes. No. I didn't say it's stable. I'm saying it exists. So anywhere in this phase diagram, if you start right at the equilibrium, then nothing will move. The rules of the game. Yes, but as I said, the problem to do stability are these cone things that we. But numerically, it seems that's the point. I mean, except here, numerically, and we tried, to perturb by an epsilon equilibrium that we can compute because we have all the equations that I've shown you, and we're far from instability. So all the equilibrium is feasible. We can compute it. So we can start right at equilibrium and see what happens. Well, actually, we don't even need to include noise because there's numerical noise in the equation. And then we see what happens. And in this phase, it just stays there. And in these phases, it goes away. No. Yeah. But the problem, as I said, the problem is that it's even the linear stability analysis is extremely complicated. Well, I don't know, because there are these excess fluctuations. I think from the start, that either you're not in equilibrium because otherwise you wouldn't be able to explain the amplitude of the fluctuations to start with. So this is, you don't even have to measure much. You just see from what I said that, I mean, the fluctuations of the GDP with shocks should be 1/n, and in the US n is huge. So there are orders of magnitude also in financial markets. The volatility of stocks is much too high compared to what it should be. So I think that the idea is really between this scenario here, which is non-critical. So for example, there's no long memory effect. There are maybe periodicities or chaos that lead to autocorrelation in time that are not particularly long range, and the scenario that I've erased here, where you're close to a critical point, where you would have maybe avalanches and all these things. And so one thing that could be interesting to try to measure empirically is how avalanches propagate. So for example, this is a model of avalanches, and you could see whether inventories or time to produce, they tend to propagate over the whole system. So we're trying to get data, for example, on that. Thank you.